The assumption that Jesus' traditions circulated anonymously in the early church, and therefore the Gospels in which they were gathered and recorded were also originally anonymous, was very widespread in 20th century Gospel scholarship. It was propagated by the form critics as a corollary to their use of the model of folklore, which is passed down anonymously by communities. The Gospels, they thought, were folk literature, similarly anonymous. This use of the model of folklore has been discredited, partly because there is a great difference between folk traditions passed down over centuries and the short span of time, less than a lifetime, that elapsed before Gospels were written. But it is remarkable how tenacious has been the idea that not only the traditions, but the Gospels themselves were originally anonymous.
The first and perhaps biggest problem for the theory of the anonymous Gospels is this. No anonymous copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John have ever been found. They do not exist. As far as we know, they never have. Instead, as New Testament scholar Simon Gathercole has demonstrated, the ancient manuscripts are unanimous in attributing these books to the apostles and their companions. In reviewing the titles in the earliest Greek manuscripts of each of the Gospels, we notice three things. First, there is a striking absence of any anonymous Gospel manuscripts. That is because they don't exist. Not even one. The reason this is so significant is that one of the most basic rules in the study of New Testament manuscripts, a practice known as textual criticism, is that you go back to the earliest and best Greek copies to see what they actually say. Not what you wish they said, but what they actually say. When it comes to the titles of the Gospels, not only the earliest and best manuscripts, but all of the ancient manuscripts, without exception in every language, attribute the four Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Second, there is some variation in the form of the titles. For example, some of the later manuscripts omit the word gospel. However, as New Testament scholar Michael Bird notes, there is absolute uniformity in the authors to whom each of the books is attributed. One reason this is so important is because some scholars will claim that the Greek manuscripts support the idea that the titles of the Gospels were added later. For example, Bart Ehrman writes,
Because our surviving Greek manuscripts provide such a wide variety of different titles for the Gospels, textual scholars have long realized that their familiar names, the Gospel according to Matthew, do not go back to a single original title, but were added later by scribes.
Where is the wide variety of titles that he is talking about? The only significant difference is that in some later copies, the word gospel is missing, probably because the title was abbreviated. In fact, it is precisely the familiar names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that are found in every single manuscript we possess. According to the basic rules of textual criticism, then, if anything is original in the titles, it is the names of the authors. They are at least as original as any other part of the Gospels for which we have unanimous manuscript evidence. Third, and this is important, the titles are present in the most ancient copies of each Gospel we possess, including the earliest fragments known as papyri, from the papyrus leaves of which they were made. For example, the earliest Greek manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew contains the title, The Gospel According to Matthew, Greek, Euangelion kata Mattheon, Papyrus 4. Likewise, the oldest Greek copy of the beginning of the Gospel of Mark starts with the title, The Gospel According to Mark, Greek, Euangelion kata Markon. This famous manuscript, which is known as Codex Sinaiticus because it was discovered on Mount Sinai, is widely regarded as one of the most reliable ancient copies of the New Testament ever found. Along similar lines, the oldest known copy of the Gospel of Luke begins with the words, The Gospel According to Luke, Greek, Euangelion kata Lukon, Papyrus 75. Finally, the earliest manuscript of the Gospel of John that exists is only a tiny fragment of the Gospel. Fortunately, however, the first page is preserved, and it reads, The Gospel According to John, Greek, Euangelion kata Ioannein, Papyrus 66. In short, The earliest and best copies of the four Gospels are unanimously attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There is absolutely no manuscript evidence, and thus no actual historical evidence, to support the claim that originally the Gospels had no titles. In light of this complete lack of anonymous copies, New Testament scholar Martin Hengel writes,
Let those who deny the great age, and therefore the basic originality of the gospel superscriptions, in order to preserve their good, critical conscience, give a better explanation of the completely unanimous and relatively early attestation of these titles, their origin, and the names of the authors associated with them. Such an explanation has yet to be given, and it never will be. There is an absolute uniformity in the authors attributed to the four Gospels. Matthew is always called Matthew, and Luke is always called Luke, and so forth.